It was a pleasant evening, and I smiled and laughed, seemingly for the first time in a year. Old friends did that for me, and for just one fleeting evening it seemed as if the events of the past year had never happened. Old friends leave a mark in our heart that remains even when they leave. And when you see them again, even if after a long separation, they become the same part that fits perfectly into that space, and it feels like they never left. In fact, they never left. I was the one who left. I packed my bags one day, took a few things that were most important to me, and left. You need to know me, to have lived with me for a very long time, to fully understand what that statement means. I am a person who forms attachments. When I buy a car, I hold on to it until it's driven its last mile yet. It suits me and it feels right. I don't just buy a house, I live in it. I'm attached to it. The walls become my fortress and the land around it nourishes me. My work becomes my calling. I get up in the morning with excitement and go to bed at night with satisfaction for a day well spent. My friends are everything to me and my family comes first. And yet, I find myself 1,000 miles away from the place I called home just a year ago. I left home, quit my job, and most importantly, I left my wife. I certainly didn't disappear. I just decided to leave without warning and didn't tell anyone about it. I didn't hide, and over time I responded to their emails and text messages, eventually answering phone calls and talking to those I left behind. I resisted their pleas to return and broke away from my old life and started a new one. Today, for this one day, all of that fell away. Jean MacDonald had always been my friend. We grew up together, went to school together, married sisters, and lived only a mile apart. He was only in town for one night, traveling from New York to Boston for work. He had come into town late the night before and checked into a hotel off the highway. Jean was so attentive. This morning he was at my front door at 7:30 a.m. with 2 cups of coffee and that mischievous grin I knew all too well. I opened the door dressed only in my boxers. "Well, are we going to have breakfast, or are you going to stand there picking your ass all day?" Jean had a way with words. I held out my hand. "You want a sniff?" "Shit, you asshole. No, I don't want a sniff. Put your pants on. I want to have breakfast with you. And wash your goddamn hands. Ladies, if you're reading this, I'm sorry, but this is what guys say and do when you're not around. You don't have to like it. Just try to ignore it. We'll be on our best behavior when you see us. Well, most of the time. I have one of those apartments that some wealthy people build over their garage when they want someone to keep an eye on the place while they travel to expensive and exotic places. I know that sounds bitter. The truth is the Smiths, that's actually their name, are good people who have earned what they have and are generous to others. I was looking for a small and simple place to live. My needs were minimal. Here I didn't have loud roommates screaming, having sex, and having crazy parties day and night. So, Jean could make himself comfortable in the living room while I showered and we called out to each other. "So, how are you here? Is Providence everything you hoped it would be?" "Smart ass," I muttered to myself. "Yes, alcohol is cheap and women are easy if you don't mind chest hair." I heard him cough through the wall. 1 point behind me. Damn, that image will stay with me. The day was drawing to a close. I think by now you've figured out that Jean and I aren't very prim. We don't need fine dining, so I took us to a favorite diner in a small town. It had a nicer crowd, better food, and darker coffee. "So, what are you doing all the time? How's the new job going? Have you made any friends?" "Who the hell are you, my mom?" "Yeah, the job is good. I've made a few friends, or at least I have people who don't make me run the other way when I see them." "Are you looking for someone for fun?" "No, Mommy, but I keep my nose clean." "I told you to stop doing that. It's disgusting." I just smiled and shook my head looking at my plate. This man, my friend, worked with some top-notch engineers and businessmen, but you'd never guess it if you listened to him. He could turn himself on and off like a chameleon, blending into his environment. "Come on, I've got 12, maybe 14 hours before I need to get back, get a good night's sleep, and hit the road when the sun comes up. What are you going to do to entertain me?" "Well, there are a bunch of gay bars downtown. I know where they are, but I've never been there." He shook his head. "No. Claire's really strict about that. It's her ass and no one else's." "Is that what you said? I love your wife, but I don't need to hear it." He chuckled, going over his plate of beer, hash, and eggs. This guy, this cocky goon, adored his wife as much as I'd once adored my own. I've got news for you. If that's what I think, I don't need to hear it. No, it isn't. Claire's pregnant. Well, that was all I needed to hear. I shrieked and jumped to my feet. Pulling him out of the chair and into a bear hug, I yelled, "Son of a bitch! When were you going to tell me?" He laughed like a fool, and we got the attention of everyone in the diner. The parents and kids were not thrilled with my outburst. I looked around the room and said loudly, "Can you believe it? They let anyone be a dad now?" This elicited smiles and applause as we sat down at the table again. "Actually, Henry, you embarrass me sometimes with your inappropriate behavior." He had to cough to keep from choking. "What kind of role model are you going to be for your godson?" "What? Godson? Really?" Gene just turned his head sideways and raised his fork like people do, as if to say, "Sure, who else?" There was that smirk again. "Claire insists. I tried to talk her out of it, but you know how she can be when she makes a decision." There was no doubt about it. This day was starting to be the best day of the year. Gene and I had grown up by the water. As kids, we fished the docks and wandered around the boatyards. When we were old enough, our fathers bought us an old snipe sailboat that needed a lot of work. The four of us spent that winter rebuilding and repairing the hull, fixing sails and replacing slings. We were able to build the boat before we even learned how to sail it. We studied our knots, learned the language, and read books on sailing. Much to the disappointment of our mothers, our fathers sent us sailing in early spring long before warm water made capsizing even remotely safe. Sailing became more than a hobby. For both of us, it was a way of life. So, when breakfast was done, we headed up the coast to check out the yards. The sailing crowd can be a great group of people, and we soon found ourselves crewing for an older couple who were going to spend the day on the water. They did offer us dinner when we got back, but we didn't want that. We treated them to the best dinner our tattered clothes could afford. The piers serve the same dinner as the expensive places, but the price is less and the view is better. We had a beautiful day. Back at my place that night, we opened a few beers, sat on the plastic chairs I'd left behind the garage, and talked. We talked about the day gone by, the work we'd both done, and Claire. We talked about the comings and goings home, about all the friends I'd left behind. We talked about everything but the one thing that had left me isolated. Finally, the time came when Gene needed to return to his hotel room. Sleep would give him a quick escape in the morning before the commuter traffic filled the roads into knots. In a quiet, almost apologetic voice, he said, "She's dying without you, Henry." "She'll live. She didn't need me before. She certainly doesn't need me now." "She needs you, and the guilt is killing her. She cries when she goes to bed at night. She doesn't go out anywhere. I swear she doesn't see anyone. Claire comes over and sits with her, and all she does is talk about you and crying. She knows she screwed up, Henry. She doesn't justify what she did." "Has she ever explained why she did it?" "No. She's seeing a shrink, but she doesn't seem any closer to an answer now than she was before." "Tell her to get a new shrink. She needs you, Henry, your arms around her, not some damn stranger with books and theories." "She had me, but that wasn't enough. Just talk to her, Henry. You don't have to take her back. Just say you forgive her. Tell her you don't hate her, at least she needs that much." "I don't know if I ever hated her. I was angry and hurt beyond anything I thought possible. I never believed she could do that to me. When she did, everything died. I don't hate her, and I don't dislike her. I just miss the woman I married. But that woman is dead, if she ever existed at all." "She existed, Henry, and she exists now. I can't explain why she did it, and I don't know what I would do if I were in your shoes. I just know she's burning from the inside out, and you're the only one who can fix it." "And who's going to fix me, Gene? How can I feel whole again?" "Maybe you can fix each other. Isn't it at least worth a try? It's been a year. Are you happier than when you left? What have you got to lose?" "Everything. Nothing. I don't know. I think about her, and I wonder what would happen if she did it again. What would happen if I let her back in, trusted her again, and she betrayed me again? It would be a longer journey than the first time. Where will I be if I fall again?" "You won't, Henry. She'll never make that mistake again." "How do you know, for she can't explain why she did it the first time? And was it even the first time? Did you ever find out who the asshole was?" "Yeah, she told Claire he was just a guy she worked with." It was dark by then, but even in the dark, Jean could feel my eyes taking in his. He doesn't work there anymore. I have to give this to you, Henry. She went to his wife and told her everything. She apologized and got slapped around for her troubles. The asshole got dragged through a nasty divorce and left town. He's not around anymore. It doesn't matter, Jean. Half the world is men and there's always another waiting for his chance. No one else has a chance, Henry. She's a single woman and her man lives in Providence. Pick up the phone and she'll answer it for you. Say the word and she'll move. She'll live here in this house, or she'll go to an apartment with you or whatever. Trust me, Henry, she's doing penance and she's got her head on straight right now. All you have to do is pick up the phone and call her. I'll think about it. Jean hung his head and thought he'd failed. We stacked the chairs, took the empty cans to the jars, and said our goodbyes. Over the past year, almost all of my friends and relatives had traveled to Providence to discuss the same thing. My sister was the first, and she failed grandly. She walked through the door and, hands on hips, began berating me for running away like a child. She soon found herself standing outside, knocking on the same door again, but there was no answer from inside. When I finally opened the door, she apologized, begging for forgiveness and patience. Her visit had been short and botched, so she had warned the others of what to expect, so they each took their own approach. Jean was the only one who had the patience and history to find the time needed. I sat alone in my apartment that night, and as my thoughts returned to the past year, I reached out and turned off the only light bulb that illuminated the room. I asked myself the same question Jean had asked me. Was I happier now than when I left? I had to admit that I wasn't. I didn't care any more than I did the day I left town. I remembered that day when I stood at the altar and unconditionally made those vows, until death do us part. And I thought, then why stop it? This is for eternity. But it didn't last long. It all happened so quickly and without warning. There was no indication that my wife was cheating because she wasn't. She had always been a faithful and loving spouse who reassured me when I needed encouragement and quietly mentored me privately in those rare moments when I needed a loving nudge. Supposedly I was an adult, but I retained the bad habits of my youth. I still had some of those old buttons built in, and when they were pushed, it was bad. I knew I could take offense quickly. She pulled out most of her patience and support for me. However, any sense of betrayal from a friend or coworker would bring devastation. It was an old problem caused by insecurity that had haunted me my whole life. When she cheated, it was that old reflex that put gasoline on the fire of her betrayal. It was the same response that kept me away from her for a year, refusing to talk to her, rejecting any request for forgiveness. I simply razed our marriage to the ground and walked away. It happened when she was out of town due to work. She didn't travel often, but it usually meant that she spent most of the week checking collections and contract compliance. She traveled as part of a team that checked books while others checked production and test results. The trip in question was a long one, as many subcontractors had to be investigated. In the evenings, the team would go out to dinner and blow off steam. This was the second night of the site visit. She danced selflessly and drank too much. It was a bad decision, and in the morning she said she deeply regretted it. Her friends told her to keep it to herself and never tell me, that nothing good would come of it, and she reluctantly agreed. The asshole kept trying to repeat it until she threatened to report him to HR. They were being eavesdropped on. She had no idea she had an enemy at work, but this person overheard the argument, and her fate was sealed. A week later, when the same coworker felt he wasn't getting the attention he deserved, I received an anonymous email. When confronted, my wife confessed. It was only one time and people became human, but it shook my marriage. I packed very few of my belongings and left without warning, leaving my wife devastated behind me. Since then, I have relived that day again 100 times, and here I was, reliving it again. It was all so fresh in my mind. I thought again, am I happier than when I left? I lived in isolation, with no social life and no one to share my life with. Neither of us ever filed for divorce, and I never realized it. When I left, I naturally assumed she would file for the divorce she wanted. The overwhelming anguish and sense of worthlessness of a year ago gave way to a malaise that never left me. There was no one to make me smile, no one to laugh at my jokes, and no one I could hold at night. Am I any happier than when I left? I sat in the dark and pondered my life. Then I slowly stood up and hesitantly reached for my phone.